Final Fantasy II is best known for its non-standard experience gains and character growth systems. Unfortunately, this infamy obscures the game's far more compelling departures from its predecessor. Compared to the bare-bones narrative of the first Final Fantasy, FF2's story is something of a revelation. A single, cohesive narrative stretches from the opening text to the end credits, teasing upcoming developments through copious foreshadowing all the while. The limited capacity for acting available to 8-bit sprites is used as effectively as possible. There are honest-to-goodness character arcs. Not bad for a game released in 1988. But FF2's greater emphasis on narrative isn't the only thing that differentiates it from its predecessor. And I would argue that this other aspect of FF2's storytelling may very well have been entirely a product of its time. This had nothing to do with FF2 releasing on archaic hardware in an infant industry. In fact, the influence of which I speak had nothing to do with gaming at all. In 1988, the Iron Curtain had yet to fall. Final Fantasy II presents a tone that's all but unique in Final Fantasy. There's none of the moral ambiguity of the later games, of course. Palamisi is an evil empire bent on conquering the world and slaughtering anyone in its way. But while FF2 relied heavily on narrative elements from Star Wars, it was no rollicking space adventure. The game opens with the party left for dead and their home conquered and burned. The only meaningful resistance to the Empire, the Wild Rose Rebellion, has gone underground in a remote village and is commanded by a princess as the king has been mortally wounded. Her fiancé, the prince of an allied nation, is quickly killed and succeeded by his worthless coward of a brother. What weapons the rebellion can scrounge together are handily outclassed by weapons forged by the Empire from mithril it extracts from its conquered territories through forced labor. As the game continues, much of its cast is forced to give their life for the cause. 3 party members sacrifice themselves, one leaves behind a young daughter, and another is the world's last dragoon. Even the game's Cid is killed defending his airship. FF2 then is overwhelmingly a desperate, somber affair. Could this grim tone have been influenced by the much more pessimistic geopolitical outlook of its time? Final Fantasy II was a game made in the final days of the Cold War. It's important to remember that, as inevitable as it may seem in retrospect, the fall of the Soviet Union came as a massive shock when it happened. And that means that Final Fantasy II was made in a world that saw itself as facing a very real threat of nuclear annihilation. Consider the Dreadnought. It's seen as FF2's equivalent of the Death Star, for obvious reasons. But the differences in the roles these 2 weapons of mass destruction play in their respective narratives is quite telling. Star Wars immediately and simultaneously introduces both the Death Star's planet-killing abilities and the planet it's used to kill. Once this threat is established, the heroes are sufficiently motivated and no further planets need be destroyed. The Dreadnought, on the other hand, starts out as a looming threat. FF2 makes sure the players are aware that it's a problem quite a ways before it tasks them with destroying it. And then, just as the party is about to reach it, it takes off and wreaks havoc on practically everything accessible up to that point. The game then proceeds to twist the knife further by allowing players to explore the flaming wreckage and speak with the villagers who lost everything in the assault. And that's not even the worst of it. Ultimately, those same towns are wiped off the map and rendered inaccessible after being hit a second time by the cyclone. The weapons possessed by FF2's Empire, then, are no mere Star Wars homage. Rather, they appear to channel real contemporary anxiety about the danger of resisting Imperial aggression. Interestingly enough, when Final Fantasy returned to the theme of rebellion against an evil empire in 1994, after the sudden, all but bloodless fall of the Soviet Union, said empire collapsed for reasons outside of the party's control. Given the reduction in anxiety about nuclear-armed empires, it's only natural that Final Fantasy VI's anti-imperial resistance arc should be the more lighthearted portion of that game. But that's not to say that FF6's concerns are unrelated to contemporary geopolitics. Where FF2 appears concerned with the physical threat posed by a nuclear-armed empire, FF6 focuses on the ideological threat of nihilism. Kefka destroys the Empire, appropriates his world's gods, and shatters its order, and presents the player with a specter of meaninglessness. In other words, FF6 is a perfect representation of post-Cold War anxieties. As terrifying as it is to have the Dreadnought looming overhead, its presence at least guarantees that whatever sacrifices one is called to make will mean something. A world with no stable source of meaning is even more frightening in a lot of ways. With that said, at the time of FF6's release, it certainly seemed like Final Fantasy intended it to function as something of a farewell to the world order defined by the Cold War. And then, 2 decades later, the series chose to raise the specter of the Cold War once more. Final Fantasy XV, like Final Fantasy VI, features an evil empire that collapses on its own. The way FF15's empire is portrayed, however, harkens back to Final Fantasy II's initial take on the Cold War. One interesting aspect of Final Fantasy II's portrayal of resistance against an evil empire is that empire's infernal associations. The Palamecian army is composed not of human beings but demons, and the Emperor ultimately conquers and commands hell itself. Such a blatantly eschatological edge might appear strange for a narrative otherwise driven by politics, but it's actually quite telling. First, it serves as an effective symbol of the utter dehumanization inherent to totalitarian militancy. FF2's Emperor isn't interested in commanding a force composed of human individuals. He prefers an army of mindless demons from hell. FF15 merges this with the technocratic aspect of FF6's empire into something even more horrific: mass-produced cannon fodder murder machines. Niflheim doesn't just replace its soldiers with demons, it grows thousands upon thousands of identical humans in tubes from infancy for the explicit purpose of infecting them with a deadly parasite and blending them into the demonic sludge needed to animate its MTs. Second, it reflects the horror inherent to war. Both FF2 and FF15, after all, are games in which war is unremittingly awful for everyone involved. It makes perfect sense for that to be represented symbolically through their choice of enemies. Furthermore, each game associates weapons of mass destruction with infernal powers in one way or another. FF15 just happens to be more on the nose about it, depicting the Empire's city-destroying superweapon as an enormous missile-spewing demon. With that said, the anxieties motivating Final Fantasy XV are not ultimately Final Fantasy II's Cold War anxieties or even Final Fantasy VI's post-Cold War anxieties, but post-Cold War anxieties all its own. Where FF2 is concerned with the threat of physical annihilation, and FF6 is concerned with the threat of meaninglessness associated with the fall of totalitarianism, FF15 is concerned with the sorts of fallout that can ensue when corruption is employed as a tool. Its demons were set loose upon the world through research into biological weaponry and generate a phenomenon reminiscent of nuclear winter. The Niflheim Empire operates not just through open violence, but also through ideological subversion, and the threat it poses doesn't evaporate when it falls. If anything, the demons it has unleashed are even more capable of dragging the world into a state roughly approximating hell when loosed from the restraints of the Empire's self-interest. Unfortunately, this concern is proven horribly prescient. As the former Soviet Union and China have both handily demonstrated since FF15's release, zombie totalitarianism is still entirely capable of wreaking havoc as it self-destructs, unleashing violence and plague upon the rest of the world in the process. Is this Final Fantasy's last word on the Cold War? It's hard to say. At the moment, it doesn't seem like there's much another game could add, and Final Fantasy XVI quite reasonably showed no interest in making the attempt. But the future is ever-changing, and regardless of what it holds, it's always worth considering the potential impact of the Cold War when analyzing Final Fantasy's use of the evil empire trope.